to a really good author and a really good reviewer.
So when does he get here?
When does he get here? Well, by magic, now. Excellent. Kai has promised to get the party started.
Yeah.
And now sit and enjoy. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Well, as it was mentioned, we had an interview earlier today where we went through the beginning of Tim Newman's career.
Yeah. We didn't get that far, so
yeah.
we're back.
So we're going back.
Yeah. Who was here at the earlier one? Put your hands up. Right. Okay. Well, we'll do a kind of previously in Tim Newman's interviews with highlights bits now to get you all up to speed who weren't, and hopefully not annoy too much those of you who were.
Well, we were covering quite a variety of topics. Actually, here's the beginning, where you wrote for for different magazines.
Yes, done all
mostly men's magazines.
Yeah, I wrote for men's magazines and left-wing political magazines.
Yes.
So that's more or less at the same time. And I did. I worked for whoever would pay.
We also went through your first published work, which was Elsa Beyond Belief.
Yep.
Which is now kind of, forgotten.
Yeah, except by eBay.
Yeah, except by eBay. Because
and of course the thing is, it doesn't matter how much money the book goes for on eBay, we don't get any royalties from that. We never earned out our pathetic advance. So the fact that it's now an enormously valuable book that I've only got one copy of doesn't really do me or Neil a hell of a lot of good.
because we must mention that it was co-written with Neil Gaiman.
Co-edited.
Yeah, co-edited.
Neil went around saying he'd written it, and I sort of pointed out that no, we just copied bits out. That's, which is quite the same.
You went through your beginnings as a fiction writer, especially the novels you wrote for Games Workshop in their Dark Future and Warhammer Fantasy universes.
Yep, did that, I'm afraid.
Yep. We also mentioned the fact of alternate history, which you started with, in many ways, writing as part of the Dark Future novels.
Yeah, I think I'd done some other stuff earlier. I'm trying to, because I've written quite a bit of this stuff over the years. I'm trying to remember what my first sort of alternate history story was. I think it's a short story that was in the zone called Famous Monsters, which was a sequel to War of the Worlds, which is what would the 20th century have been like after the War of the Worlds. And it was about a Martian who kind of got left behind in the war and went to Hollywood and started playing stereotypical Martian bad guys in all the melodramatic films they made about the War of the Worlds. And then there was a second War of the Worlds, which was much nastier. So that was not only my first sort of alternate history story, but it was my first attempt at doing that alternate history that's not predicated on history, but is predicated on other people's books.
Fiction.
Yeah, the logical follow-up to someone else's work. So, and as I've gone back a couple of times since. So.
And this led us to one of your most famous novels, A New Dracula.
Yep. Okay. So let's pick up with that since we didn't talk much about that. Yep. I'm trying to think. Because of the Jack Yeovil novels, I'm never quite sure of the numbering of my books. But it was my fourth published novel under my own name. And the previous books, there was a science fiction novel called The Nightmare, which is also a hard-boiled 1940s crime type story, and two horror novels, Bad Dreams and Jago, which I think of all my books are the ones that most closely resemble what genre books are supposed to do, in that they came out in the 90s, but they were 80s style horror novels. One of them started out as a film outline for a movie, and we were basically told, write a rip-off of Nightmare on Elm Street. And so my book, Bad Dreams, even though it changed a lot in the process, started out to the brief of a rip-off of Nightmare on Elm Street. And Jago was an attempt to write one of those big, fat, Salem's Lot, ghost story type horrible things happen in a small town novels. But after that, I ended up, Anno Dracula was an idea I had for a long time. At university, yesterday I was talking about this, I did this thesis about 19th century end of the world narratives and invasion narratives, you know, not just War of the Worlds, but the things like the Battle of Dorking, all these books written from the 1870 onwards about, you know, ruthless Prussians invading Britain. Or quite often evil French people, because in the late 19th century we were as worried about the French as we were about the Germans. We'd been to war with France for many, many more times. So there are lots of books in which basically versions of Napoleon or Bismarck override Britain and invade and occupy and conquer. And then there were all those Nazis won the war stories. You know, The Man in the High Castle and Keith Roberts' story of Weihnachten I really like, and The Sound of His Horn by Sarban, which I really recommend, a great little horror story. And I thought, well, the thing that had stuck in my head is maybe you could apply that to Dracula. In the section of my thesis about invasion narratives, I put a footnote saying that Dracula could be considered an invasion narrative because at the beginning of Stoker's novel he talks like a military commander rather than a monster. He talks about, basically his campaign to come to Britain. And Van Helsing has this great speech about what Dracula wants, which is to create a breed of people whose course runs through death rather than through life. But then the plot of Dracula sort of skips to something else. It's all about him trying to seduce the wife of a provincial solicitor rather than take over the country, which has always struck me as being actually a bit weak for something who's supposed to be like the most evil villain in the world. Although actually one of the strengths of Stoker's novel is that Dracula is a surprisingly fallible, ultimate bad guy. So it stuck in the back of my mind ever since I wrote this footnote that there was another way of telling this story in which Dracula doesn't get sidetracked, in which he basically kills Van Helsing and sticks his head on a pike and conquers Britain and replaces Prince Albert as the Prince Consort and then brings all his disgusting old vampire mates to come and run the country and the empire, and then all the stuff that devolves from that. But it's basically a Nazis won the war book with vampires. So that's the high concept. And because in horror as a genre, and in fact, not even that, I think in popular culture, there is something about this very, very brief period between sort of 1870 and World War I, when so many of our key stories were invented. That's the period where you've got, let me list some of them. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Dracula, Dorian Gray, Jekyll and Hyde, Peter Pan, Sherlock Holmes, Trilby, She, Alraune, The Phantom of the Opera, The Lost World. That's 50 years, that's more stuff than we've had in the 100 years since, or in the 500 years before. Those are like the big things. There was something about the late 19th century and the way culture was racing that has thrown up all these, in Hollywood terms, active franchises. We are still making these stories every year. I can guarantee Wizard of Oz, that's another one. I left out most of the Americans in that list, and there's a lot of really good stuff, Nick Carter. So that's why, not just me, but I think so many authors are drawn back to that period. And it's historically an interesting period as well. That thesis I wrote while I was doing this course called Late Victorian Revolt, where we looked at lots and lots of social things that were happening, but also literary and cultural things, and so many things that are now part of our lives began there. So many things that, I mean, when quite a lot of the modern sort of rash of, you know, what you might call steampunk strikes me as being fundamentally nostalgic. Wasn't it great and all these wonderful fancy machines and that thing. And what interests me about that period is not what's gone or what was the potential that was unfulfilled, but what stuck around, what we're still with. And it was the beginnings of like tabloid journalism and advertising and mass communications and celebrity culture and all these things I actually hate, you know, started then. And so I've tended to address that in the book. And because Anno Dracula is, apart from anything else, a vampire novel, it's a novel that, you know, latches onto other novels and sucks them dry. I had this feeling that, you know, the vampire is a really useful metaphor for all these things. Yeah, the idea that our lives get incrementally worse in ways we don't notice. I was, you know, talking about, yeah, I suppose at the time I was writing, this was the very late 80s, early 90s. So, yeah, Mrs. Thatcher was still around, Ronald Reagan, you know, all that. So there's that kind of influence you can see building in. But when I came back to the series recently, nothing had changed. You know, there were still politicians that you could hate, and still there are people that, you know, I don't know, Rupert Murdoch, whoever, people I feel are, yeah, malign influences. Sometimes even without their intentions. I think we underestimate just how accidental some of the evil is. But so that was the thing that struck me about this, and that's why it ended up not being just a single book but a series. And also a series that covers the whole century. There's a World War I story. There's a with vampires. Here's the thing that I fundamentally realized early on: with vampires doesn't make that much difference. It makes it interesting sometimes, but it doesn't actually change that much in the way people act. Yeah, because, yeah, I mean, I've held off on doing a contemporary set one, but things just keep happening that make me realise I'm probably going to have to do one. In Britain, the National Health was on the point of selling off its entire blood supply to a really dodgy American company. You know, one of those sort of black bag take you to Guantanamo Bay type security companies. They were about to own our blood. You know, you think, well, come on, it's like that's just a gift, isn't it? It's like the world is telling me that this is still going to happen. So yeah, I may well go back to it, although not anytime soon.
Which brings us kind of to your latest novel in this universe, Johnny Allenpower.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more about it.
Well, the one, I'm not entirely sure it is a novel, although it ended up being rewritten to be a novel. It was originally a series of linked short stories. And it's different from the other books for just reasons of variety. The other books, they were all set in 1 year. One of them, I think, is set in 1 month. And in a very small areas. Even the World War I book is set in a quite tight geographic area and not over that much time. And I just wanted to pull back and have a larger, kind of more mosaic picture of the world. There is a sort of sense that I want the books to take in a different perspective with each installment. Now, the first one's set in London, the second one's set in a war, basically France, Germany, the third one's set in Rome, and this is set in America mostly, so that's a big place, and quite a bit of Transylvania where I hadn't written about before, so I had to go back and do that side of the story. And it takes place over decades, and instead of having a sort of conventional focused narrative. It has a leading character, but you follow them sort of elliptically. You're not always with them, and sometimes they're not even in the story. But the rise of our leading character, who is sort of the successor to Dracula, John Alucard's name that comes from one of my favourite films, Dracula, AD 1972. So I wanted to do something that was just different in style from the other books. But I realised, having done 4 of these things now, and 2 lengthy novellas that basically add up to a 5th book, there are certain things that I wanted to be in each book. Each book has a first-person section. Each book has a sequence with 2 mad scientists. It's a kind of La Ronde of mad scientists, starting with Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Moreau, and then going through Herbert West and Dr. Pretorius. And the last one is Dr. Pretorius and Mr. Hyde, take us back into where we began. So I wanted to keep that up, and one of the useful things about writing a series with vampires is that your lead characters can live a long time, so you don't have to make up new ones. And that means that they have individual arcs that go throughout the series. And so I was able to play with them a bit and revisit my leading people. But also one of the main characters had actually died in the last book. Maybe 2 of them did. But I then had to structure this book around their absence and the hole that they had left in the world and what might rush in to fill it. That may well be where I go in the next book, but I'm not 100% sure what that's going to be yet.
Which brings us to the fact that you use fictional characters, taken from other sources, other books, other novels.
Appropriated or stolen, I believe is the word. I usually don't quite leave them alone, so that's,
Which is kind of interesting, because in a way you were one of the first, you weren't the first, but you were one of the first to use this technique, and which is now quite commonplace. If you take, for instance, the coming horror series Penny Dreadful, about where Frankenstein's monster, Dr. Moreau, is connected to the Ripper case.
It may well be that what we're thinking of is those Universal movies of the 1940s. With Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman together. I mean, I loved those films as a kid, so that may well have been. And Philip Jose Farmer, the American author who wrote Tarzan Alive, did a lot of that stuff, and he was kind of a big influence on me when I was a teenager. Still actually a great fan of his work. So other people have done it before me. I felt that as I said earlier to Reed, I want you to think about them. I want you to think about Dracula, or Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Moreau are characters who espouse really interesting philosophies, and it was good to have them sort of discuss and debate, and I loved all doing that stuff. But some of the characters who are maybe less well known are just there because I needed a policeman. Or somebody had to be there to do something. I probably have wasted more of my life trying to find like a vampire hairdresser for the story, which I didn't manage to do, because I got into this kick of trying to invent as few people as possible for the series. It gives it a certain familiarity, and sometimes it's there's an element of criticism. In Dracula Cha-Cha-Cha, the 3rd book, there's a sort of James Bond character, and he's there partly to show what a dick James Bond is. There's something, and again, it's a theme throughout the series of questioning our ideas of what heroism is. And so I have featured many kind of British pulp heroes, Bulldog Drummond, Raffles, like that, who I am fond of on one level, but also I find the underlying assumptions of the works profoundly disturbing. That's probably the thing in which I'm closest to Alan Moore's approach to it. Or I think slightly less likely to rate the characters that he
Yeah,
is.
because as one can see, there are similarities between the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and well, earlier today you said that you might have to reconsider to writing Anno Dracula
if he'd done it first, I'd still have written Anno Dracula because it was already in the works, it was already an idea. I would have done it differently. But hey, yeah, yeah, that's the way it is. I don't know, I mean, it's now so inextricably part of the books. You always think, yeah, what would I have changed anything? I probably wouldn't. I like that side of things. It gets a bit distracting when all people want to do is track down every single name and reference rather than follow the story. And it's particularly distracting because some of these books I wrote quite a while ago and I've actually forgotten what I meant. Quite often it's where you're just making up a list of people who are at a party. And I don't know where I took some of those characters from. Some of them come from very obscure places. I tried to use almost every fictional vampire in some way. And that meant that in the book set in Rome, I just looked at all the vampire movies that had been made in Italy in the 1960s. And so that's where most of those characters come from. And the Mexican ones as well. And all that. And then when I ran out of those, I started looking at the most obscure vampire movies. And the trouble is some of them have sort of foolish names, which don't really sound well. I've actually quite enjoyed that thing of taking characters who are sort of despised and don't have much resonance and trying to redeem them a bit. It's how I amuse myself while writing. I hope that translates to the readers getting something out of it.
So, going on back to going forward here, after Johnny Alucard, will this be the last novel in that series?
No, it's not, because I am contractually obliged to deliver another one. I don't quite know what it's going to be yet. I've had several sort of near misses as to what it might be. It may even end up being 3 novellas that follow, or maybe 4, following the 4 different characters I've got, because there are various. Each of these books, and the novels, they sort of inhabit a different type of story. There's a Victorian melodrama, a World War I flying aces, spy novel, murder mystery, and Hollywood story. So there are other genres that I might try. Any
ideas? Which genres?
Well, one possible was a Western. And in the first book, I sort of set up a Western idea. There's a story about the vampire Billy the Kid. And that comes from this thing that's in Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, where one of the posse who want to kill Billy the Kid says the only way to kill him is to grind up silver dollars into buckshot and shotgun. And so he's going to kill him with silver. And that's a great vampire killing thing. I think Sam Peckinpah made this up, but it's in 2 different films, is that Billy took the... I am not going to go around saying, even though I can point to this passage in my book, and Uwe Boll is German, and Anno Dracula was a big seller in Germany. Not that I'm saying he stole anything, it may even be part of the Blood Rain ongoing games franchise. But that kind of meant I can't do that story now, so I'd have to think of another Western. I was thinking a bit about doing a 1980s, 90s Japanese high-tech thriller, sort of, gunplay, martial arts stuff with a, manga schoolgirl vampire character, because that's something that's sort of come up recently since, and I've introduced a manga schoolgirl vampire into the series, so I might like to do a story with her because she's kind of fun to write, and then I just look around and see what gaps I've got in the history that could be plugged. there was a thought of maybe doing one set in the future, but the trouble with that is it's, because I did that with another series I wrote a sort of 30 years hence, sorry, but that sort of ties you down to one ending and you may not want to go there. So anyway, I also have to do a comic, in that I'm contracted with my publisher Titan, who also do comics, to do an Anno Dracula comic of some kind. But that, I think, will go back to the first book, and it'll be set in the 1890s, like 4 or 5 years after Anno Dracula, and it will be a, fog and gaslight type story, but not a direct continuation of the story. It'll be a self-contained story.
Which brings us to all the media universe.
I do try and work in other fields. Every couple of years I try and do something I've not done before, just to stretch myself. So a while back I directed a short film I wrote, a very tiny short. It's on my website, it's only 100 seconds long. It's called Missing Girl. And then I did some writing for radio. I wrote a radio play called Cry Babies. And I've done some other things on audio recently, which is, again, I grew up listening to radio drama and comedy. It's still a thing in Britain. I don't know if you have it here, but it's still an accessible form, and there are things you can do on radio you can't do in books or you couldn't do in films. There are things you can, bluntly, there are things that are funny if you can't see them, that would be really upsetting if you could. And so I wrote a black comedy called Sarah Minds the Dog, which is full of the most repulsive, awful things. But because you can't see them, it's quite funny. So I enjoyed doing that. Then I did a stage play a few years back, which was one of those Dr. Terrace House of Horrors, Dead of Night type bunch of stories with a frame story. I commissioned some other writers to do the stories, and I wrote the frame. And that had a West End run. When I say West End, I mean one of the smallest theatres in the West End, but it's still in the West End. And that was really interesting. I'd like to do more theatre. And recently I have been doing comics with another writer called Moriarty. I've just finished writing a series for Dark Horse, which is a spin-off from the Hellboy comics. Do you know those here? They were made into movies by Guillermo del Toro. And it's Mike Mignola, the man who created Hellboy, sort of, I've met him a couple of times. He's a big Anno Dracula fan. He sort of approached me and said, would I like to write this character they have, who is a sort of Victorian psychic investigator character. And I was sort of reluctant originally because it was almost too much like the kind of stuff I do. And they'd established that he had a sort of vampire Jack the Ripper type adventure. I thought, well, I've done one of those. I can't do another. But it was a sweet deal. They were nice people. I liked them and I liked their work. And so I brought Maureen, who'd written comics before, and she was one of the contributors to the play. So we worked together, and we came up with something that was different in tone from what Dark Horse had done before, but it was different in tone from what I had done before as well. And I've seen art for the first issue. It looks gorgeous. I mean, it's got eel monsters in it. And very topically for Britain, there's floods in it as well. So we had a lot of fun writing that. But that's been a very positive experience. It's one of those things I've been a bit wary of getting involved with comics, because people I know in comics tend to have nervous breakdowns and sort of chew the tables when you start talking about what's management like. But as yet, I haven't had any of those problems. I mean, everybody's been lovely to work with. The thing is, this comic's not out yet, so it's
Speaking of Barry, which brings us to the other two types of media that are quite prevalent.
Anno Dracula is a TV series at the moment. I like them, they're good people, but yeah, I'm a bit worried there have been too many similar things recently that have not been good, which is not a useful precedent. Yeah, but I wish them well, and it would be nice if they made them. I don't want to spend all my life pitching film and TV properties. I'd much rather write books that get published than scripts that don't get made. So I tend to take the meetings, and I'll do stuff if asked. And I've met some nice people, and I had some interesting experiences out of it. I developed a project for Roger Corman, and that was really exciting, even if it didn't work out at the end. And so I was saying earlier, I wrote a porn movie for Lars von Trier's company. That was an experience and a half.
How did you get into writing for Lars von Trier,
there's a guy called Nicholas Barbano, who's a Danish film critic and science fiction fan, but he was also producing Central porn movies. And he did that thing and say that happens when you're around enough. People like your work, and quite often they don't ask you because they think we couldn't get it. Yeah, you would say, and of course I'll say yes if you pay me. It's like, and if it's something that's not going to eat up too much of your life, that's the problem with film things. They quite often do eat up too much of your life. But Nicholas just said, look, do you want to write this? Have you got any ideas that would work? And I had a short story that I thought, well, that could be the premise for a porn movie. And so, I wrote it from the sublime position of not having seen that in porn movies, so not knowing what they were actually like. And the director, they decided, was just like that as well, so we sort of giggled a bit. And I think the thing that I remembered was when David Cronenberg's film of Crash came out, one of the reviewers said rather sniffily, a succession of unrelated sex scenes isn't a story. And David Cronenberg said, why not? And David Cronenberg is really clever. But since most of the scripts in the industry consist of 3 sides of paper with "she calls for a plumber," written on it, that wasn't that difficult. But I had a fun time doing that thing. It took 3 days to write. I'm not going to say that was a major commitment of my time.
Because films is also a very big part of your career. You have your own column each month in Empire Magazine.
Absolutely,
Convenience with You Dungeon.
Yep, still
and
doing
you
that.
also deliver commentaries and expert opinions regarding documentaries for special editions for DVDs.
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of that over the years. I mean, I worry a bit that I'm becoming a bit overexposed on that. They do quite often come to me and just say, what do you think about The Stuff or Squirm or Dead of Night? And I'll witter on rather like this for 20 minutes and it'll come out on the disc. No, I'm pleased to be able to do that. It's sort of, actually it's not particularly high pressure. It's a nice thing to do. I mean, I keep the column going as well. I mean, that's actually quite a demand because that means watching sort of 15 films a month, not all of them. Sorry, not many of them good.
Because you have commented a bit about the sci-fi films, sci-fi and asylum films.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that stuff. There's an undertone of contempt for the audience that I don't think plays well. It started in the 80s with Troma films, where there's a sort of sense that the filmmakers have given up on trying to make anything good, so they put in a couple of jokes and then claim it was kitsch or cult or whatever from the beginning. I'd much rather watch Attack of the 50-Foot Woman from the 50s, or Empire of the Ants from the 70s. Those are honestly bad films, and yet magnificent. And so I'm, I'd say I've turned into a grumbling old git saying things were better in the old days. I worry that today's sort of kids won't have the fun nostalgia that people who grew up in the 50s with I Was a Teenage Werewolf, or people who grew up through the 60s and 70s with the kind of fun, schlocky horror pictures of the day, the Hammer films, the Roger Corman movies, then even to the early 80s and sort of the Halloween-type slasher movies that are around then, that people who grew up on them genuinely feel nostalgic. I know people who will just shove on a tape of Prom Night 2 or Happy Birthday to Me and feel this warm, lovable glow of nostalgia about it. Yeah. And I think you're not going to get that for Sharknado. It's just crap. There is no feeling to it. There's no sense that it catches the tone of the times or whatever. I mean, it's like, because it was when I was starting as a film critic, was the early 80s. So I saw all those He Knows You're Alone, Don't Look in the Basement type movies in cinemas as they came out, while writing Note, House on Sorority Row, Slumber Party Massacre one week, and what I didn't realise at the time was that in the future you look back on them and it's not, oh my God, he's going to get that's a really disgusting special effect. It's, look at that wallpaper, or did people walk around with hair like that? Or what are they listening to? And that sort of thing, which is part of that kind of pulp genre movie. I feel sorely lacking. As horror films today seem to take place, even good ones, seem to take place in a kind of cultural vacuum. I think maybe they're a bit embarrassed by earlier films. Whenever they do like a remake of Nightmare on Elm Street or When a Stranger Calls or whatever, they sort of set it in these some nebulous, no particular time where the fashions and the hairstyles and the music are sort of, they're not current, they're a bit off, they're a bit wrong, and so when you look at them in 10 years' time, they won't seem to have been made anywhere. Whereas what's nice in a way about some of those ill-considered slasher films of the 80s, that they do show you what the 80s looked like.
Which is actually most times the most scary with a couple of those things.
Yeah.
The time capsule they are.
Yeah.
But is this regarding your, to go back a bit about the project here, regarding that, it seems like you write a lot about films, but in a way, you take a lot of inspiration from films when you write?
I write a lot about films, I write a lot about books as well, and what I always think is that, Arthur C. Clarke was sort of an astrophysicist. He spent a lot of time thinking about space stations and rockets and satellites or whatever. So he had lots of ideas connected with those things, and that fed into his fiction. I spend a lot of time thinking about, movies, the movie business, pop culture, the pop culture business, music, TV, newspapers, magazines, whatever. That's the world I live in. And so naturally, my story ideas quite often spring out of that. That means all the way back to that thing I was talking about, Anno Dracula, and reading Dracula and thinking this isn't the way I would have gone with the story. It's like you do that when you read other people's stuff, but I've written, particularly in Johnny Alucard, but also in a novel of mine, The Quorum, I've written about the media, about the kind of world I live in. The people I know, the offices they work in, the particular demands and pressures and all that kind of stuff. Because, they tell you to write what you know. That is what I know. I live in Islington and I spend quite a lot of time in Soho. I am around the media all the time. I spend a lot of time at the BBC. So naturally, that's where the ideas come from. And so I've written a lot about that. But then again, sometimes, things will just come completely out of nowhere, and I'll write stuff that is not connected with that. The next book I've got coming out is a ghost story. Almost because I wanted to write something that was standalone, and not just standalone in the sense of not being connected to my other books, but standalone in the sense of you don't really need to know that much to appreciate it. It's you know, 4 people living in a haunted house. Everybody knows families. Everybody has ghost stories. Whereas I think some of my other stuff is very insider. You know, I like writing corridors of power. I like writing newsrooms, and you know, Fleet Street pubs and all the places I know, because that's what I see and hear all the time. I heard somebody, to do with a ridiculous kerfuffle that went on recently, someone accused somebody else of being evil because they had access. And I don't think anyone really seeks it, but yes, I have access. I could, there are things I can get that many people who don't live the kind of life I do can't because of that. That's not a good or a bad thing, it's just a thing. But that also means that I know a lot of stuff.
So, what do you see for future with your career?
Well, I never even think of my career, I'm sorry. I'm just making it up as I go along. It's like, if I had a career pattern, I wouldn't have done a lot of the things I did. I've devoted a lot of time to a lot of things that interest me, but maybe are always going to be limited audience. I think I've been quite lucky in finding a larger readership for some of what I've written. But that's not something that I feel obliged to do with every project. And that's quite a risky sort of approach to take in the modern world of publishing. I'm lucky to have a very supportive publisher who are interested in all of my work rather than, we'll just take the ones that are going to sell a lot, and you can put the others out with a small press. But that's not. Let's say if I had a career plan, I would have written, I don't know, a big fat fantasy series or something. And I kind of got my big fat fantasy ideas out of the way with the Warhammer stuff early. So that's not a field I've ever felt the need to go back to.
So, any more things you want to add to this conversation?
Well, I'm trying to think what else. I wrote a book about Professor Moriarty, Hound of the D'Urbervilles. That's another one that went in there. I was quite pleased with that. I may do another one. Although, of course, he goes over a waterfall at the end, so that kind of screws up the possibility of another book about him. But another book about Sebastian Moran, who's number 2 guy, which will be called After Moriarty. I'm working on a 1920s school story. Again, I don't know if you have the cultural references, but Mallory Towers, Greyfriars, Billy Bunter, yes, and Trinians, that stuff. I'm going to do one of those, but which has a kind of macabre and slightly science fictional. It's sort of there's a pulp element to it as well. I've been, and the other book this is all stuff I'm contracted to do, so I can tell you. I'm doing a book called Angels of Music, which is a mashup of The Phantom of the Opera and Charlie's Angels. The
nice sign here from Heidi.
Okay.
So, any questions?
Yeah, of course, we forgot that bit. So, you the questions. Yes, thank you.
I didn't get that being the first thing you talked about, being afraid of Prussians invading. Well, I mean, because you had Hanoverians invading, or is it just because of that?
No.
You had Germans on the throne, so why do you prefer?
Oh no, I mean, but that said, all through the late 19th century, partly you have to understand how scary Prussia was in the late 19th century. They beat France, so they beat the guys that we usually played with. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, and one of the great British heroes of the 19th century was Prince Albert, who was German. But and frankly, Prussia was run by Queen Victoria's relatives, which is why they changed their name to Windsor at some point from their original. So yeah, but no, but fear of Germany was a big thing. It was all down to one book, actually, The Battle of Dorking, which was successful as a kind of scary science fiction novel. It's about Britain being invaded, and it was a shocking thing. But the person who wrote it was a retired general called George Tompkins Cheney, and he wrote it as a propaganda piece. He wanted to say, we aren't prepared to fight this war. And yeah, he wrote this book about what would happen if they invaded us, when they would, by his lights, win. And a load of other people wrote books like that. And some people followed by writing sort of patriotic sequels in which we beat them. Yeah, saying no, they could never invade Dorking because the fleet would stop them and all that. But it was this big. And the thing that I find really fascinating about this is these books were really popular in Germany in translation as well. And there are German ones on similar themes. And so in the sort of 50 years before World War I, there was this kind of arms race in science fiction books about the next war. And the sad thing is they were all wrong, because they all were sort of influenced very much by Verne and Wells, and there's a great guy called George Griffith, and they all have, you know, vast submarines and dirigibles and dreadnoughts and terrifying weapons, which meant that wars lasted about 20 minutes, you know, and resulted in the absolute and utter defeat of one of the party who weren't technologically on a level with the other. So they were all propagandizing for people to spend money on their armies. But of course what happened in World War I is it was fought by people with shovels. Yeah, and it was a huge deadlock. And in the end it was the oldest things of war. It was, men and disease and digging is what the war was. Okay, there was little things with aeroplanes and machine guns and all this kind of stuff. But it was not the war that all these people saw coming.
Yeah. Next question.
Kim, I was thinking that maybe you could call your after Moriarty novel Post Moriarty. Or
Yeah, that's interesting.
that's it. That's the whole.
Last question.
Come on, somebody must have something.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone
Yeah.
has something bad.
Yeah, I mean, just because I've been joining a magazine called Watchdog for a long time. And
Oh, yeah.
crops up
Yes,
there
I
quite
work
a
for
lot.
that too.
Can you just say a little bit about how
Yeah.
that came about and
That-
how you work with them?
That came about because they asked me. Video Watchdog is. I talked this morning about my book Nightmare Movies, saying that it required so much work that it didn't matter how much money you paid for it, you couldn't possibly pay for the hours. Video Watchdog is the magazine equivalent of that. It pays very little. It has enormous prestige. You get great feedback for working for it. And obviously, as you realise, all the right people read it, even though it's not a big circulation. So it's a good thing to be in, but it is so much work. I'll put it like this. It's sort of something like sometimes writing a feature for Video Watchdog is a full week's work. Writing an equivalent length feature for Empire, you could do in a morning. Writing an equivalent length piece for Sight and Sound, which is a much more demanding market, you can still do that in a morning. But Video Watchdog, there's so much more to do. And I sort of stay with it because I think it's good for me. I think it's good for me to keep being challenged and to keep keep asking myself to do things that I'm not sure I can do. Because it's very easy. I mean, I work for Empire, which is the Britain's, I think the world's biggest film magazine at the moment. And I can do that. It's actually quite easy for me. Partly because the format is very rigid and structured, and it's like the word lengths for reviews. They're dead set and tight. And there's a certain challenge, particularly to writing a 100-word review of something that does it some kind of justice. But it's something that I can do easily. Writing a video Watchdog study of all the versions of 7 Keys to Baldpate, or I've just done a piece on 4 different versions of A for Andromeda. Yeah.
I think we're unfortunately out of time.
I think,
Kim Newman, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.